The basket maker's fingers were bleeding onto the willow reeds when Xavier Cordell rode into Lead, South Dakota, with a barrel full of silver dollars and a promise that would change everything. Lambert had been weaving baskets since she was 8 years old, taught by her mother who had learned from her grandmother, a skill passed down through generations of women who knew what it meant to survive on the very edge of nothing. Now at 22, her hands moved with practiced precision through the pliable strips of willow and ash, creating vessels that were both beautiful and functional. She sold them at the general store, at the trading post, and sometimes directly to the miners' wives who came to her small cabin on the outskirts of town. The money she earned went towards salt, flour, and whatever other necessities she could afford. Salt was expensive in the Dakota Territory in 1878, hauled in by wagon from distant places, and Kira measured her life in the small portions she could purchase with each basket sold. The morning Xavier arrived, she was sitting on the wooden steps of her cabin, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her fingers working through a particularly stubborn piece of reed that kept wanting to split. The sun was already climbing high, promising another hot August day, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the shade from the porch overhang. She did not look up when she heard the horse approaching, assuming it was just another miner heading toward the claims in the hills where gold still occasionally showed itself in frustrating, tantalizing flecks. But the horse stopped directly in front of her cabin, and she heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted. Only then did she glance up, her brown eyes meeting the bluest gaze she had ever seen. The man standing before her was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty shirt, and a face that spoke of long days under the sun and longer nights under the stars. He could not have been much older than she was, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. "You are Kira Lambert," he said, and it was not a question. "I am," she replied cautiously, setting down the basket and wiping her bleeding fingers on the apron she wore over her faded calico dress. "Who is asking?" "Xavier Cordell," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed almost old-fashioned, courtly even. "I have been looking for you." She felt her heart quicken, though she could not say why. Strangers did not typically seek her out, and when they did, it was usually because they wanted something she could not afford to give. What for? He turned back to his horse, a magnificent bay gelding with intelligent eyes, and untied something from his saddle. When he turned back around, he was carrying a barrel, not large but substantial enough that she could hear the clink of metal inside when he moved. He set it down on the ground between them with a solid thunk that seemed to echo in the quiet morning air. "I have been watching you," he said, and when her eyes widened in alarm, he quickly added, "Not in any improper way, miss. I have been in Lead for 3 weeks now, managing my family's mining operation up in the hills. I have seen you sitting here, day after day, your fingers working until they bleed, selling everything you make just to survive. I have asked about you in town." "You have no right," she began, but he held up a hand. "You are correct, I have no right, but I have the means and I have a proposition for you." He gestured to the barrel. "There is enough money in here to keep you comfortable for 2 years, maybe 3 if you are careful. Enough to buy salt and flour and whatever else you need without counting every penny." Kira stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. "What would you want in return?" Her voice was harder now, edged with suspicion. She had heard stories of men who made such offers, and they never ended well for the women involved. Xavier's expression shifted, something almost like hurt crossing his features. "Nothing untoward, I swear it. I want you to keep weaving your baskets, but not for need. Not for salt money or to pay for your next meal. I want you to weave for pleasure now, to create because you love the craft, not because you must. She stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Why would you do that? You do not even know me. I know that you start working before the sun rises, and you do not stop until your hands are too cramped to continue. I know that you sometimes go to bed hungry because you have sold your baskets, but not yet bought your supplies. I know that you have a gift, that your work is beautiful, and that it is a crime against nature itself that such talent should be wasted on mere survival. You cannot just give me money, she protested, even as something inside her yearned to reach for the barrel, to accept this impossible offer. People would talk. They would say things. Let them talk, Xavier said firmly. But if it matters to you, then consider this an investment. I want to commission your work. My family has business interests beyond mining. We deal in fine goods, in items that wealthy people in cities like San Francisco and Denver pay premium prices for. Your baskets could sell for 10 times what you get for them here. 20 times, even. But you cannot create the kind of work that commands those prices when you are racing against hunger. She looked down at her bleeding fingers, at the half-finished basket that would earn her perhaps 50 cents at the general store. She thought about the empty salt cellar in her kitchen, about the way her stomach had cramped with hunger just last night, about the bone-deep weariness that came from never having enough. If I accept, she said slowly, what would you expect? Truly? Xavier's blue eyes held hers steadily. I would expect you to weave, to learn and grow in your craft. I would come by occasionally to see your progress, to collect pieces for shipment to the cities. And perhaps, if you were willing, you might teach me something about your work. I have spent my whole life focused on extracting wealth from the earth, and I find myself curious about creation rather than destruction. There was something in his voice, a loneliness that echoed her own, that made her decision. Very well, she said. But I will keep an accounting of everything you give me, and if your business venture succeeds, I will repay you. That is not necessary, he began, but she cut him off. It is necessary to me. I will not be anyone's charity case, Mr. Cordell, not even yours. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made her breath catch. I would expect nothing less, Miss Lambert, and please call me Xavier. Kira, she replied, and found herself smiling back despite her better judgment. He stayed for an hour that first morning, sitting on her porch steps and asking questions about her work with genuine interest. She showed him how she selected the willow and ash, how she soaked and prepared the materials, how each basket started with a solid base and built upward in a spiral pattern that was as mathematical as it was artistic. His questions were intelligent, thoughtful, and she found herself relaxing in his presence, the initial suspicion fading into something warmer. When he finally rose to leave, he paused beside his horse. May I come back tomorrow? I would like to see more of your process. If you wish, she said, trying to sound casual even as her heart beat faster at the prospect. She watched him ride away, dust rising from his horse's hooves, and then she turned to look at the barrel he had left behind. With trembling hands, she pried open the lid and gasped. Silver dollars filled it nearly to the brim, more money than she had seen in her entire life. There was a note resting on top of the coins, written in a strong, clear hand, for the artist that she might create without fear. Kira sat down hard on the steps, her legs giving out beneath her. She cried then, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of relief so profound it was almost painful. For the first time since her mother had died 3 years ago, leaving her alone in this rough mining town, she felt something like hope. Xavier returned the next morning as promised, and the morning after that. Each day he would arrive around mid-morning after his work at the mine was underway and he could spare a few hours. He would sit with her on the porch or inside her small cabin when the sun grew too hot, watching her work and asking questions that made her think about her craft in new ways. "Why do you choose this pattern over that one?" he asked one day, pointing to two half-finished baskets. She paused in her weaving, considering. "The tighter pattern is stronger, better for carrying heavy items, but the looser weave is more beautiful and it allows light to pass through in interesting ways. It depends on the purpose." "So you think about function even as you create beauty," he observed. "One should not exclude the other," she replied. "Beauty that serves no purpose is just decoration. Function without beauty is merely utilitarian. The best work combines both." He smiled at that, and she noticed how the smile reached his eyes, creating small creases at the corners. "My mother would like you. She is always saying that father and I think too much about profit and not enough about quality." It was the first time he had mentioned his family beyond vague references to their business interests. "Are they here in Lade?" she asked. "No, they are in Deadwood, about 3 miles west of here. Father oversees the main operations there. I was sent here to manage our interests in Lade because he thinks I need to learn responsibility." There was a note of frustration in his voice that made her curious. "You do not agree?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the hills where the mine scarred the landscape. "I think there are different kinds of responsibility. My father believes in building wealth, in expansion and acquisition. Those things matter, I suppose. But lately, I find myself wondering about what we leave behind beyond money. What is the point of extracting all this gold and silver from the earth if we do not create something meaningful with it? Is that why you are here?" Kira asked softly. "With me and my baskets." He turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply could not stop thinking about the woman on the porch who weaves beauty from her own bleeding hands." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Kira had never felt before. She looked away first, her cheeks flushing, and turned her attention back to her weaving with perhaps more focus than necessary. As the days turned into weeks, Xavier's visits became the center point around which Kira's life revolved. She found herself waking earlier, taking more care with her appearance, braiding her hair in more elaborate styles and wearing her better dress, even though she was just going to be sitting and weaving all day. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply taking pride in herself now that she was not quite so desperately poor. But in her heart, she knew the truth. She was falling for Xavier Cordell, for his kindness and his questions, and the way he looked at her as though she were something precious. The problem was that Xavier came from money, from a family with business interests and properties and expectations. She was the daughter of a basket weaver, with no family and no prospects beyond her craft. The gulf between them seemed insurmountable, and yet each day he bridged it simply by showing up, by sitting with her, by treating her work and her thoughts as valuable. One afternoon in late September, when the air had finally begun to cool from the brutal summer heat, Xavier arrived with a large package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something," he said, looking almost nervous. She set aside the basket she had been working on, a large piece with an intricate diamond pattern that she was particularly proud of. "Xavier, you have already given me so much. This is different. Please open it." She unwrapped the package carefully, and her breath caught when she saw what lay inside. Rolls of materials she had never worked with before, strips of birch bark, sweet grass, and what looked like thin sheets of cedar. There were also small pots of natural dyes in colors, she could only dream of creating herself. I wrote to a trader I know in Minnesota, Xavier explained. The Ojibwe people there create baskets from these materials. I thought you might enjoy experimenting with new techniques. Kira ran her fingers over the birch bark, feeling its smooth texture, already imagining the possibilities. This must have cost a fortune. Worth every penny to see that look on your face, he said quietly. She looked up at him, and something shifted between them in that moment. The careful distance they had both been maintaining, the unspoken acknowledgement of the differences in their stations, suddenly seemed less important than the connection that had been growing between them. "Why are you really doing all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The truth, Xavier." He moved closer, kneeling down beside her chair so that their faces were level. "Because from the moment I saw you, I could not look away. Because your strength and your talent and your determination to maintain your dignity, even in poverty, are the most beautiful things I have ever witnessed. Because I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who measure worth in gold, and you have shown me that true value has nothing to do with money." "I am not a charity case," she said, but her voice lacked conviction now. "You have never been that," he replied. "You are the woman I am falling in love with, and I am terrified that you will send me away when you realize it." Kira's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. "I would be a fool to send you away. Then I may call on you properly, court you as you deserve." She reached out and touched his face, her calloused fingers gentle against his sun-roughened skin. "You have been courting me all along, Xavier Cordell. I think it is time we both acknowledged it." He kissed her then, soft and careful as though she were something fragile that might break. She kissed him back with all the longing that had been building inside her for weeks, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I should speak with your father," Xavier said, then paused. "You mentioned that your mother passed. What about your father?" Kira's expression grew somber. "He died when I was 5, killed in a mining accident. My mother never remarried. She said she had loved once and that was enough for one lifetime." "I am sorry," Xavier said, taking her hand in his. "That must have been difficult." "It was, but my mother was strong. She taught me to be the same." Kira squeezed his hand. "She also taught me that love, real love, is worth risking everything for. She told me that just before she died. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was. I wish you could have met her. She would have liked you, I think. She always said that a man's character shows in how he treats those who can do nothing for him." Xavier smiled. "And what does my character show?" "That you are the kind of man worth loving," Kira replied simply. From that day forward, their relationship shifted into something openly romantic. Xavier still came to watch her weave, but now he would sit closer, sometimes with his arm around her shoulders or his hand holding hers. They talked about everything. His dreams of creating something more meaningful than just another mining fortune, her memories of her mother and the stories that had been woven into every basket, their hopes for a future that seemed suddenly bright with possibility. The people of Lead noticed, of course. Gossip spread through the small town like wildfire. Some people were scandalous and judgmental, whispering about the poor basket maker who had snared a rich man's son. But others, particularly the women who had bought Kira's baskets over the years and knew her character, were happy for her. Mrs. Henderson at the general store made a point of congratulating her publicly. Old Tom at the livery stable winked at Xavier and told him he had good taste. The biggest hurdle came when Xavier announced that he wanted Kira to meet his parents. They made the 3-mile journey to Deadwood on a crisp October morning. With Kira dressed in the new dress, Xavier had insisted on buying her. She had protested at first, but he had pointed out that she was meeting his family as his intended, and he wanted her to feel confident. The dress was a deep blue wool that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, with a proper bustle and matching jacket. She felt like someone else in it, someone who belonged in parlors and dining rooms rather than a one-room cabin with sawdust on the floor. The Cordell house in Deadwood was not a mansion, but it was certainly the finest home Kira had ever entered. 2 stories of whitewashed wood with real glass windows and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Inside, the furniture was Eastern-made, shipped at great expense across the plains and up into the Black Hills. Mrs. Cordell met them at the door, an elegant woman in her late 40s with Xavier's blue eyes and an assessing gaze that made Kira want to fidget. "So you are the basket weaver," Mrs. Cordell said, and Kira could not tell if it was approval or disapproval in her voice. "Yes, madam," Kira replied, keeping her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Thank you for inviting me into your home." Mrs. Cordell studied her for a long moment, then turned to her son. "Xavier, go help your father with something in his study. I would like to speak with Miss Lambert alone." Xavier looked like he wanted to protest, but Kira gave him a small nod. Whatever his mother wanted to say, it was better to hear it now and directly. He squeezed her hand once before disappearing down the hallway. Mrs. Cordell led Kira into a sitting room decorated in shades of cream and gold. She gestured for Kira to sit, then took the chair opposite. For a long moment, she simply looked at Kira, and Kira forced herself to meet that gaze without flinching. "My son tells me that you are exceptionally talented," Mrs. Cordell finally said. "I do my best work, madam. He also tells me that you refused to simply accept his money, that you insisted on keeping an accounting so that you could repay him." "Yes, madam. I will not be indebted to anyone, even someone I care for." Something shifted in Mrs. Cordell's expression, a slight softening around her eyes. "You understand that Xavier is my only son, that his father and I have certain expectations for his future." "I do," Kira said quietly. "And I understand that I am not what you would have chosen for him, but I promise you, Mrs. Cordell, I love your son, not his money, not his prospects. I would love him just as much if he were a simple ranch hand or a store clerk." "That is easy to say," Mrs. Cordell replied. "It is the truth. I was prepared to refuse his courtship when I realized the differences in our situations. He was the one who insisted that such things did not matter." Kira leaned forward slightly. "I know you have no reason to trust me, no reason to believe my intentions are pure. All I can tell you is that I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of your son's love, if you will give me the chance." Mrs. Cordell was quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then, to Kira's surprise, she smiled. "Xavier said you were strong-willed, that you refused to be cowed by circumstances or by people who look down on you because of your poverty." "Your son seems to appreciate that about me," Kira said carefully. "So do I." Mrs. Cordell stood and walked to a cabinet, removing something that she brought back to Kira. It was a basket, beautiful and clearly old, with a pattern that Kira recognized instantly. "This was your mother's work," Kira breathed, taking the basket with reverent hands. "She sold this basket 15 years ago, maybe more. I remember her telling me about it. A woman paid $5 for it, which was a fortune to us." "I was that woman," Mrs. Cordell said. "I had just arrived in the Black Hills with my husband. We had very little furniture, very few comforts. Your mother's basket was one of the first beautiful things I owned in this rough place. I have treasured it ever since." She paused. "When Xavier told me the basket maker's daughter was courting, I suspected it might be you. Your mother and I spoke briefly that day. She told me about her daughter who was learning the craft, who had gentle hands and a strong spirit. I never forgot her." Kira felt tears prick her eyes. "She would be so honored to know you kept it, that you valued her work." I value skill and integrity, Mrs. Cordell said. Your mother had both, and from what I can see, so do you. If you make my son happy, if you continue to challenge him to be better than simply another mining magnate, then you have my blessing. The relief that washed over Kira was so intense she felt dizzy. Thank you, she managed. That means more than I can say. Now then, Mrs. Cordell said, her tone becoming brisk, let us discuss the practical matters. I assume Xavier intends to propose properly. We have not discussed specifics, Kira admitted. Men rarely do. But you should know that the Cordells have a reputation in this territory. When Xavier marries, it will be a significant social event. You will need more dresses, you will need to learn certain social graces, and you will need to be prepared for the scrutiny that comes with the family name. I understand. I do not say this to frighten you, but to prepare you. There will be women who resent you, men who try to take advantage of your perceived inexperience. You must be ready for that. I have spent my life proving myself, Kira said firmly. I think I can handle a few society gossips. Mrs. Cordell laughed at that, a genuine sound of amusement. I think you will do just fine, my dear, just fine indeed. When Xavier returned with his father, a stern-looking man with silver hair and calculating eyes, he found his mother and Kira discussing wedding plans as though they had been friends for years. His father proved more difficult to win over, clearly skeptical of Kira's suitability. But when Xavier showed him examples of Kira's work, including several pieces she had created with the new materials, and explained his plan to develop a high-end market for her baskets in the coastal cities, his father's expression shifted to one of interest. The margins would be substantial, Mr. Cordell mused, examining a particularly intricate piece. And there is very little overhead once she is established. You might actually have a good business sense after all, son. Xavier rolled his eyes at Kira, who had to suppress a smile. By the time they left Deadwood that evening, Kira felt as though she had run a marathon. But she also felt accepted, welcomed into a family she had feared would reject her. The proposal came on a November evening, just as the first snow began to fall. Xavier had taken her to a spot in the hills where the view opened up to show miles of territory stretching into the distance. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the snowflakes caught the light like tiny diamonds. I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, Xavier said, taking both her hands in his, but I feel like I have known you my entire life. Like I was incomplete until I saw you on that porch, creating beauty despite everything. Xavier, she began, but he shook his head. Let me finish. I want to build a life with you, Kira. Not the life my father planned for me, not the life society expects. I want to wake up every morning with you beside me. I want to watch you create your art. I want to build something that matters, something that lasts beyond profits and losses. Will you marry me? He pulled out a ring, simple but beautiful, with a small diamond set in silver that caught the fading light. Kira looked at it, then at his face, and saw her entire future written in his eyes. Yes, she said, and her voice was strong and clear. Yes, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he kissed her as the snow fell around them, and Kira thought that her mother would have been so happy to see this moment, to know that her daughter had found the kind of love worth risking everything for. They married in December, a small ceremony in Deadwood with only family and close friends attending. Kira wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Cordell had helped her choose, and she carried a bouquet of dried flowers woven together with willow reeds, a nod to the craft that had brought them together. Xavier wore a new suit, but he had refused to cut his hair any shorter, saying he liked the way Kira ran her fingers through it. The reception was held at the Cordell house, and Kira found herself surrounded by well-wishers, some genuine and some clearly attending out of curiosity. She handled it all with the same grace she had shown in poverty, neither arrogant nor obsequious, simply herself. Xavier stood beside her the entire time, his hand at the small of her back, a silent declaration of support. Mrs. Henderson from the general store presented them with a beautiful quilt she had made, and old Tom gave them a set of horseshoes he swore were lucky. Other gifts ranged from practical items like cookware to more elaborate presents from Xavier's business associates. But the gift Kira treasured most was a small package from Mrs. Cordell, which contained her mother's original basket and a note that read, "For the beginning of your own traditions." They spent their wedding night at the house Xavier had been renting in Lead, though he promised they would build something better come spring. Kira did not care about the size of the house or the quality of the furniture. All that mattered was that she was with the man she loved, that they were beginning their life together on terms they had chosen for themselves. "Are you happy?" Xavier asked as they lay together in the darkness, her head resting on his chest so she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly. "There were times when I thought I would die in that cabin, alone and poor, with nothing to show for my life but baskets that would be used and discarded. Now I have you, and a future, and possibilities I never dared to dream of." "I am the lucky one," Xavier said, kissing the top of her head. "You have taught me what really matters, Kira. Before I met you, I was just going through the motions, doing what was expected. You showed me that there is more to life than accumulation, that creation is its own reward." "We will create a good life together," she said. "One worth living." "We already have," he replied. The months that followed were perhaps the happiest of Kira's life. She continued to weave, but now without the desperate urgency of survival. Her work became more experimental, more artistic. She incorporated the materials Xavier had given her, blending different techniques to create pieces that were truly unique. Xavier, true to his word, began developing connections in San Francisco and Denver, sending samples of her work to galleries and high-end shops. The response was overwhelming. Within 3 months, Kira had more commissions than she could possibly fill. Wealthy women wanted baskets for their homes, not as utilitarian objects but as art pieces. She charged prices that would have seemed absurd when she was selling baskets for salt money, and people paid them without question. "You were right," she told Xavier one evening as they reviewed the orders that had come in. "There was a market for this work. I just needed the freedom to create it." "You needed to weave for pleasure instead of survival," he said, echoing his words from that first day. The difference shows in every piece. As her success grew, Kira found herself with more money than she had ever imagined possessing. The first thing she did was repay Xavier every penny he had given her, down to the last silver dollar. He had protested, saying it was unnecessary now that they were married, but she insisted. "You gave me that money so I could create freely," she said. "Now my creations have earned it back. The debt is paid and everything from here forward is ours together." He understood, as he always seemed to understand her need for independence even within their partnership. They invested the profits into expanding her workshop, hiring 2 young women from town who needed work and were eager to learn the craft. Kira taught them with the same patience her mother had shown her, passing on not just the technical skills but the philosophy behind the work. "Beauty and function," she would tell them. "Every basket should serve a purpose and please the eye, never sacrifice one for the other." Spring came to the Black Hills with an explosion of wildflowers and the sound of snowmelt rushing down from the high country. True to his promise, Xavier began building them a house on a piece of land overlooking Lead. It was not as grand as his parents' place in Deadwood, but it was perfect for them. Spacious enough for a large workshop for Kira, with big windows that let in natural light, and a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. Kira designed a special room just for her weaving, with organized storage for her materials and a large work table where she could lay out complex patterns. Xavier surprised her by having a rocking chair custom-made, with a cushioned seat and armrests positioned at exactly the right height for weaving. She cried when she saw it, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "I want you to be comfortable," he said, looking concerned by her tears. "If it is not right, I can have them adjust it." "It is perfect," she managed through her tears. "Everything is perfect." They moved into the house in May, and Mrs. Cordell came to help them get settled, bringing curtains she had sewn herself and her opinions on where the furniture should be placed. Kira and her mother-in-law had developed a genuine friendship over the months, based on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for quality craftsmanship. Mrs. Cordell had even started learning to weave under Kira's tutelage, though she admitted she lacked her daughter-in-law's natural talent. "Some people are born to create," Mrs. Cordell said philosophically, as she struggled with a particularly stubborn reed. "The rest of us must content ourselves with appreciation." "You are doing fine," Kira assured her. "This basket will be beautiful when it is finished." "It will be functional at best," Mrs. Cordell replied with a laugh. "But I am enjoying the process, which I suppose is the point." That summer, Xavier's business plan came to full fruition. A gallery in San Francisco agreed to showcase Kira's work exclusively, hosting an exhibition that featured over 30 of her pieces. Neither of them could travel to California for the opening due to the distance and expense, but they received telegrams and letters describing the event. The exhibition sold out within hours, with several pieces going for prices that made even Xavier's business-minded father impressed. "You have created something remarkable," Mr. Cordell told Kira at a family dinner celebrating the success. "Not just beautiful baskets, but a genuine business. I must admit, I had my doubts about Xavier's plan, but you have both proven me wrong." "Thank you," Kira said, accepting the compliment graciously. "Though I could not have done any of it without your son's support and belief in my work." "We make a good team," Xavier added, taking her hand across the table. "That you do," Mr. Cordell agreed, and there was something like pride in his eyes when he looked at his son. As the year turned toward autumn, Kira began to suspect that their family would be expanding. She waited until she was certain before telling Xavier, wanting to be absolutely sure before raising his hopes. When she finally shared the news with him on a cool September evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby," he breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. "We are going to have a baby. In the spring," she confirmed, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "April, the doctor thinks." Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of spun glass. "I am going to be a father. You are going to be a mother. This is really happening." "It is really happening," she laughed, delighting in his joy. They told their families together, traveling to Deadwood for Sunday dinner and making the announcement over dessert. Mrs. Cordell actually squealed, an undignified sound that made everyone laugh, and immediately began planning what the nursery should look like and which clothes she would sew. Mr. Cordell shook his son's hand with genuine warmth and told Kira that she was giving them the greatest gift possible. The pregnancy was easier than Kira had feared, though she had to eventually stop weaving as her belly grew too large to comfortably reach the work table. Xavier was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about whether she was too tired or too stressed or needed to eat more. She bore his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love. "I am not fragile," she told him one evening when he had insisted she should not be standing for so long. "I know you are not," he replied, "but you are carrying our child and I cannot help but want to take care of you." "You do take care of me," she said, softening. "You always have from the very beginning, but you must let me be myself too, Xavier. I need to work to create. It is part of who I am." "I know," he sighed. "I will try to give you more space. Just promise me you will rest when you need to." "I promise," she said, and kissed him to seal the deal. Winter came early that year, with heavy snows that turned the Black Hills into a landscape of white and shadow. Kira spent most of her time indoors, designing new patterns on paper since she could not physically weave. Xavier would come home from the mine each evening covered in dust, which he would carefully wash away before coming near her. They spent their evenings by the fire, talking about the future and the child they would soon meet. "You hope for a boy or a girl?" Kira asked one night as they sat together on the sofa, her feet propped up on a cushion and his hand resting gently on her swollen belly. "I do not care," Xavier said honestly. "As long as the baby is healthy and you come through the birth safely, that is all that matters." "I think a boy," Kira mused, "with your eyes and my stubborn streak." "Heaven help us if that is the case," Xavier laughed. "The child will be impossible to manage." "Good," Kira said firmly. "Let him be strong and determined and unafraid to challenge the world. That is what this land needs. People who do not simply accept what they are given but who create something better." The baby came in late April, during a rainstorm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Kira thought she might not survive it. But Xavier stayed with her the entire time, ignoring the doctor's suggestion that he wait elsewhere, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even when she screamed at him to shut up. Finally, after nearly 20 hours, their son entered the world with a wail that announced his displeasure at the situation. The doctor placed him in Kira's arms, a tiny perfect creature with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn blue like his father's. She looked down at him and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "Xavier," she whispered, "look at him. He is perfect." Xavier touched their son's tiny hand with one finger, and the baby immediately gripped it with surprising strength. "He is strong," Xavier said, his voice choked with emotion. "Like his mother." They named him Samuel after Kira's father, with Xavier as his middle name. Samuel Xavier Cordell made his opinions known from the very beginning, crying when he was hungry or uncomfortable and sleeping peacefully when he was content. Kira had worried that motherhood might interfere with her work, but she found that the opposite was true. Having Samuel gave her new inspiration, new reasons to create beautiful things. She began designing a series of cradle baskets, each one incorporating different techniques and patterns. The first one she made was for Samuel himself, woven from the softest willow and lined with fabric that misses. Cordell had embroidered with tiny birds and flowers. It was beautiful enough to be art, practical enough to be used daily, the perfect embodiment of Kira's philosophy. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, coming home early from the mine whenever possible to spend time with his son. Kira would often find them together in the nursery, Xavier talking to Samuel about mining operations or business plans as though the infant could understand and offer advice. It made her smile, seeing the man she loved with their child, building the kind of family she had always dreamed of. When Samuel was 3 months old, Kira returned to her weaving in earnest. She had hired another assistant, a woman named Margaret who had 2 children of her own and understood the balance between work and motherhood. Margaret would watch Samuel while Kira worked, bringing him to her when he needed to nurse or when he simply wanted his mother. It was a perfect arrangement that allowed Kira to remain productive while still being present for her son. The business continued to grow. Xavier had expanded their market to include shops in Chicago and even New York, and orders poured in faster than Kira and her assistants could fill them. She insisted on maintaining quality over quantity, refusing to rush work or cut corners just to increase profits. Xavier supported this decision completely, understanding that her reputation was built on excellence. "We have enough money," he told her when she worried about turning down orders. "More than enough. Let other basket makers fill the demand for ordinary work. You should focus on creating the extraordinary." It was this philosophy that led to Kira's most famous piece, a basket that took her 6 months to complete. It stood nearly 3 feet tall and was woven from birch bark, sweet grass, and thin strips of cedar, with a pattern that depicted the entire story of her life. Her childhood learning from her mother, the poverty and struggle, the moment Xavier arrived with his barrel, their courtship and marriage, and finally Samuel's birth. It was not just a basket, but a narrative woven in fiber, a testament to the idea that beauty could emerge from hardship. Xavier wanted to keep it, to display it in their home as a reminder of their journey. But Kira insisted on sending it to the gallery in San Francisco, where it sold for a price that made them both gasp. The money was donated to a fund to help poor women in the Dakota territory learn trades, a way of paying forward the help Xavier had given her. "You continue to amaze me," Xavier said when he learned what she had done. "Just when I think I cannot love you more, you prove me wrong." "We have been blessed," Kira replied simply. "It is right to share that blessing." Samuel grew into a curious, energetic toddler who loved nothing more than sitting beside his mother and playing with scraps of willow while she worked. Kira would let him help her, showing him how to bend the reeds and explaining the patterns, much as her mother had done with her. She did not know if he would carry on the tradition, but she wanted him to understand the value of creating with one's own hands. By the time Samuel was 2, Kira found herself pregnant again. This time she was less worried, knowing what to expect and trusting in her own strength. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, and when their daughter arrived in early October, it was after a labor that lasted only 6 hours. They named her Catherine Marie, after both her grandmothers, and she had her mother's brown eyes and her father's dark hair. If Samuel had been vocal about his needs, Catherine was somehow even more so, demanding attention with a persistence that made them both laugh, even in the exhausted depths of new parenthood. "We have created 2 stubborn individuals," Xavier observed one sleepless night when both children were crying in tandem. "Good," Kira said, echoing her words from before Samuel's birth. "The world needs people who refuse to give up." With 2 young children and a thriving business, their lives became a carefully choreographed dance of responsibilities and joys. Xavier had taken a step back from day-to-day management of the mine, hiring a manager so he could spend more time with his family and helping with the basket business. He handled all the commercial aspects, negotiating with galleries, managing shipping, keeping the accounts. This left Kira free to focus on the creative work she loved while still being present for her children. They fell into a rhythm that worked for them. Mornings were for family, with everyone eating breakfast together and Xavier playing with the children while Kira prepared for her workday. Midday was for work, with Kira in her studio and Xavier in the small office he had set up in their home. Evenings were for family again, with dinner and stories, and the simple domestic pleasures that Kira had once thought she would never experience. The years passed in a blur of happiness, punctuated by the ordinary challenges of life. Samuel started school and proved to be bright but restless, always eager to be doing something with his hands rather than sitting still. Catherine was quieter but no less determined, watching everything with sharp eyes and asking questions that sometimes stumped even her father. When Samuel was 6 and Catherine 4, Kira taught them both to weave their first baskets. Samuel's was lopsided and clumsy, but he was proud of it nonetheless. Catherine's was smaller but more precise, each reed carefully placed with the kind of attention to detail that Kira recognized from her own work. She did not play favorites, but she suspected that Catherine might have inherited her love of the craft in a way that Samuel had not. Xavier's father passed away when Samuel was 7, after a brief illness that took them all by surprise. Mr. Cordell had mellowed in his later years, becoming more interested in his grandchildren than in business profits. His death hit Xavier hard, and Kira supported him through the grief as he had once supported her through her struggles. "He told me he was proud of me," Xavier said one night as they lay in bed, his voice rough with unshed tears. Just before the end, "He said I had built something more valuable than any mine could produce." "He was right," Kira said, holding him close. "You have built a family, a life, something that will outlast all of us. That is worth more than any amount of gold." Mrs. Cordell moved in with them after her husband's death, taking over a room on the ground floor, and immediately making herself useful by spoiling her grandchildren and helping Kira with the household management. Far from being a burden, she became an integral part of their family, sharing wisdom from her years and providing extra hands when needed. "I am grateful to still be useful," she told Kira one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. "Some women my age feel cast aside, but you have made me feel needed." "You are needed," Kira assured her. "This family would not function nearly as well without you." As the children grew older, Kira began teaching workshops in Lade and Deadwood, passing on her skills to other women who wanted to learn. Some were poor and desperate like she had once been, seeking a way to earn money. Others were wealthier women looking for a creative outlet. Kira welcomed them all, charging the wealthy students more so she could teach the poor ones for free or reduced rates. "You are creating a legacy," Xavier told her as he watched her prepare lesson plans for the upcoming workshops. "Not just in your own work, but in all the women you are teaching." "That is what my mother did for me," Kira said. "I am just passing it forward." Their third child, a son they named James, arrived when Samuel was 10 and Catherine was 8. James was a surprise, unplanned but deeply wanted once they knew he was coming. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's steady temperament, a calm baby who seemed content to simply observe the chaos around him. "I think this one might be a philosopher," Xavier joked when James was 6 months old and could spend hours simply watching the play of light through the window. "Or an artist," Kira suggested. "He sees things differently than the others do." As James grew, they discovered he had an unusual talent for understanding patterns and colors. By the time he was 4, he was designing patterns for his mother's baskets that were mathematically complex and visually stunning. Kira incorporated some of his ideas into her work, always crediting him even though he was just a child. Samuel, true to his restless nature, announced at 15 that he wanted to study engineering. He had no interest in continuing either the mining business or the basket weaving, but he loved understanding how things worked and dreamed of building bridges and railways across the Western territories. Xavier and Kira supported his choice completely, proud that their son had found his own path. Catherine, at 13, was already weaving pieces that rivaled her mother's work. She had a natural understanding of the craft that went beyond technical skill into something almost intuitive. Kira began teaching her more advanced techniques, knowing that her daughter would likely take over the business one day. "You ever miss the old days?" Xavier asked Kira one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and purple. When it was just the two of us before all this, Kira considered the question seriously. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she admitted, "but I would not trade any of this for anything. Our children, our life together, the work we have built. This is everything I never knew I wanted." "Even the chaos," Xavier smiled, gesturing toward the house where they could hear the children arguing over something in the kitchen. "Especially the chaos," Kira laughed. "It means we are alive, that we are building something that matters." Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar calluses from years of weaving. "I still remember the first time I saw you, sitting on those steps with your hands bleeding onto your work. I knew in that moment that you were someone extraordinary." "You saw potential I did not see in myself," Kira said. "You gave me the freedom to become who I was meant to be." "We gave that to each other," Xavier corrected. "I was just going through the motions before I met you, doing what was expected without any real passion. You taught me what it means to truly live." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching as the last of the sunlight faded from the sky. Inside the house, Mrs. Cordell was settling an argument between the children, her voice patient but firm. Soon someone would call them in for dinner, and they would gather around the table as a family, sharing food and stories and the simple joy of being together. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both small and large. Samuel went east to study engineering at a prestigious university, writing long letters home about his studies and the incredible things he was learning. Catherine took over more and more of the basket business, developing her own style that complemented her mother's while remaining distinctly her own. James discovered a love of teaching, spending hours helping younger children in town learn to read and write. Xavier gradually retired from the mining business entirely, selling his interests to invest in other ventures that aligned better with his values. He funded schools and libraries across the Dakota territory, using his wealth to create opportunities for others much as he had once created opportunity for Kira. His mother watched his transformation with pride, telling Kira more than once that she had been the making of her son. "He was always a good man," Mrs. Cordell said, "but you taught him to be a great one." "We taught each other," Kira replied, as she always did. When Kira was 40, she was commissioned to create a piece for the World's Fair that was being held in Chicago. It was an enormous honor, and she spent nearly a year designing and creating a basket that would represent not just her own work, but the entire tradition of basket weaving in the American West. The final piece stood 4 feet tall and incorporated materials from across the continent: willow from the Black Hills, sweet grass from the northern plains, birch bark from Minnesota, and cedar from the Pacific Northwest. The pattern told the story of westward expansion from the perspective of those who had woven their lives into the land. Indigenous peoples whose traditions predated the settlers, immigrant women who had brought their own techniques from distant countries, and frontier women like her mother who had created beauty and utility from whatever materials they could find. It was political in a way her work had never been before, making a statement about whose stories mattered and whose contributions were often overlooked. "Are you certain about this?" Xavier asked as they packed the basket for shipment. "It may be controversial." "I am certain," Kira said firmly. For too long, women's work has been dismissed as mere craft, as something less important than the things men build. This basket says that what we create matters, that our stories deserve to be told. The basket was displayed prominently at the fair and received widespread acclaim. It did not win the top prize, which went to a more traditional piece, but it generated enormous interest and was eventually purchased by a museum where it would be preserved for future generations. Kira received letters from women across the country, thanking her for elevating their work and telling their stories. "You have become famous," Xavier teased as another stack of letters arrived. "I have become a voice for those who are usually silent," Kira corrected. "That is far more important than fame." Their life settled into a comfortable rhythm as they aged. Samuel married a fellow engineer and moved to Denver, where he built bridges that connected communities across the Rockies. Catherine married a kind man from Lead who supported her work and helped her manage the business that had grown beyond anything Kira had originally imagined. James became a teacher in Deadwood, educating the next generation of children in the Black Hills. Xavier's mother passed away peacefully in her sleep when she was 78, surrounded by her family and content in the knowledge that she had lived a full life. Her death was sad but not tragic, the natural conclusion of years well lived. They buried her next to her husband in the Deadwood Cemetery, under a headstone that described her as a beloved mother, grandmother, and friend. "She was happy here," Xavier said as they stood at her grave after the funeral. "She told me once that coming west was the best decision she ever made, despite all the hardships." "She was a strong woman," Kira agreed. "She raised a strong son." "I had a good teacher in you too," Xavier said, pulling her close. As Kira and Xavier entered their 50s, they began to slow down, letting the younger generation take over more of the daily responsibilities. Catherine ran the basket business now, with her own apprentices and her own innovations. Samuel's bridges spanned rivers and canyons, connecting places that had once been isolated. James's students grew up to be teachers and lawyers and business people, spreading his influence far beyond his classroom. But Kira never stopped weaving. Even when arthritis began to stiffen her fingers and her eyes were not as sharp as they once had been, she continued to create. The work was slower now, more deliberate, but in some ways that made it even more meaningful. Each basket felt like it might be her last, so she poured everything she had learned over a lifetime into every piece. Xavier stayed by her side through it all, his presence as constant and supportive as it had been from the very beginning. They would sit together in her studio, him reading or doing paperwork while she worked, comfortable in the kind of companionable silence that only came from decades of partnership. "You remember the day you brought that barrel of money?" Kira asked one afternoon as they sat together, her hands working slowly through a complex pattern. "Of course," Xavier said, looking up from his book. "You thought I was insane." "I thought you were too good to be true," she corrected. "I kept waiting for you to reveal some ulterior motive." "And did I? Only that you loved me," Kira smiled, "which turned out to be the best motive of all." Xavier set aside his book and came to kneel beside her chair, taking her arthritic hands gently in his. "I saw you creating beauty from suffering, and I wanted to free you from that suffering so the beauty could flourish. It was the simplest and most selfish thing I have ever done." "Selfish?" Kira raised an eyebrow. "I wanted you to create for pleasure because your pleasure became my pleasure. I wanted to see what you could do if you were not limited by poverty and desperation, and I wanted you to have time to notice me, to see me as something other than just another person passing through your life." He paused. "I fell in love with you the moment I saw you, Kira. Everything I did after that was just trying to convince you to love me back." "You convinced me quite thoroughly," she said softly, leaning down to kiss him. Their 60th year was marked by a celebration that brought family from across the territory and beyond. Samuel came from Denver with his wife and 3 children. Catherine hosted the event at her home, which was large enough to accommodate everyone. James coordinated with the town to organize a festival in Lead that celebrated not just Kira and Xavier's anniversary, but also the basket-weaving tradition that had become synonymous with the area. "You have changed this town," the mayor said during his speech at the festival. Mrs. Cordell's work has put Lead on the map as a center for fine crafts. Young people who might have left are staying because they can learn a trade here. The economy is stronger because of the business she built. Kira was embarrassed by the attention, but also deeply moved. She had never set out to change a town or build an industry. She had just wanted to weave beautiful baskets, to honor her mother's memory and support herself. Everything else had grown organically from that simple beginning. "Your mother would be so proud," Xavier whispered as they listened to speech after speech praising her accomplishments. "She would be amazed," Kira replied. "I am amazed. When I think about that girl sitting on the porch with bleeding hands, barely surviving from one day to the next, I can hardly believe this is the same life." "You were always this person," Xavier said firmly. "You just needed the opportunity to flourish. And you gave me that opportunity." "We gave it to each other," he repeated, as he always did. As they moved into their 60s and then their 70s, their pace slowed, but their contentment only deepened. They had built something lasting, something meaningful. Their children were thriving, pursuing their own dreams while carrying forward the values Kira and Xavier had instilled in them. Their grandchildren were growing up in a world with more opportunities than either Kira or Xavier had known in their youth, in no small part because of the work their grandparents had done. Kira still wove, though now it was mostly small pieces, delicate work that did not strain her failing hands too much. She focused on teaching more than creating, passing on every technique she had learned or developed to anyone who wanted to learn. Her students ranged from young girls just starting out to elderly women who had decided it was never too late to learn something new. Xavier's health began to fail when he was 74, his heart weakening after so many years of hard work. He never complained, maintaining his gentle humor and unwavering support even as his body betrayed him. Kira cared for him with the same devotion he had always shown her, adjusting her schedule so she could be with him, reading to him when his eyes grew too tired, simply sitting beside him when words were not necessary. "I have had a good life," he told her one evening as they sat together on the porch of the home he had built for her so many years ago. "Better than I ever deserved." "You deserved every moment of happiness," Kira said fiercely, holding his hand. "You are a good man, Xavier Cordell. The best man I have ever known." "I was good because you made me want to be better," he replied. "Everything worthwhile I have done, I did because of you." Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later, with Kira lying beside him and their children gathered in the next room. His last words to her were, "Thank you for weaving yourself into my life," and she held those words close as she grieved. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the impact Xavier had made on the community. He was remembered not just as a successful businessman, but as a man who had used his resources to lift up others, who had seen value where others saw only poverty, who had built bridges between different worlds. Kira grieved deeply, but she did not break. Xavier would not have wanted that, and the strength he had always admired in her did not fail her now. She continued to weave, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of her hands, in the patterns that had shaped her life. Each basket became a meditation, a way of processing her loss and honoring the man who had changed everything. She lived for another 8 years after Xavier's death, years filled with her children and grandchildren, with teaching and creating, with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. She watched as Catherine's daughter, her granddaughter Catherine, showed the same intuitive understanding of basket weaving that had skipped a generation in Samuel and James. She taught Catherine everything she knew, passing on not just the techniques but the stories behind them. "Your great-grandmother wove baskets for salt money," she told Catherine when the girl was 12. "She did it to survive, but she did it beautifully. That is something to remember. Even in the hardest times, we can create beauty. We can refuse to let circumstance define us." "And then great-grandfather came with the barrel of money," Catherine said, having heard the story many times. "And he told me to weave for pleasure now," Kira finished, smiling at the memory that was still so clear even after all these decades. "He freed me to become who I was meant to be." "That is what love does, Catherine. Real love does not confine or control. It liberates." Kira passed away on a warm spring morning when she was 82, sitting in her beloved rocking chair with a half-finished basket in her lap. She simply closed her eyes and did not open them again, slipping away as peacefully as Xavier had. Her children found her hours later, and though they wept, there was also a sense of rightness to it. She had lived fully, loved deeply, and created beauty that would outlast her by generations. They buried her next to Xavier in the Deadwood Cemetery, under a stone that read, "Kira Lambert Cordell, basket weaver, teacher, beloved wife and mother. She wove beauty into the world." At the funeral, Catherine spoke about her mother's legacy, about how a woman who had started with nothing but bleeding hands and willow reeds had built an industry and changed countless lives. Samuel talked about the lessons his mother had taught him about perseverance and integrity. James read a poem he had written about his mother's hands, those capable hands that had created so much. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Catherine, Kira's granddaughter, who stood before the assembled crowd holding a basket she had woven herself. It was small and simple, made from willow in the traditional style, but it was perfect in its execution. "My grandmother taught me that every basket tells a story," Catherine said. "This basket tells the story of a young woman who wove to survive, and a young man who saw her value when others saw only poverty. It tells the story of how love can transform lives, how freedom and support can unlock potential that might otherwise remain hidden. My grandmother wove for pleasure, as my great-grandfather told her to do that first day. But more than that, she wove with purpose. She wove to create beauty, to support herself and others, to pass on knowledge and tradition. She wove her life into every piece she created, and in doing so, she wove herself into all of us." The basket Catherine held was placed in Kira's coffin, a final gift from student to teacher, from granddaughter to grandmother. As the coffin was lowered into the ground beside Xavier's grave, those gathered could almost hear Kira's voice in the wind, patient and strong, teaching them still about beauty and function, about perseverance and love, about weaving for pleasure but also with purpose. The legacy Kira and Xavier built together continued long after both of them were gone. The basket weaving school that Catherine established in Lead drew students from across the country, teaching not just the technical skills, but the philosophy that Kira had lived by. Samuel's bridges continued to connect communities, physical manifestations of his parents' belief in bringing people together. James's former students became leaders in their communities, carrying forward the values he had taught them. Catherine grew up to become a master weaver herself, combining traditional techniques with modern innovations in a way that honored her grandmother's memory while pushing the craft forward. She wrote a book about Kira's life and work, ensuring that the story of the basket maker who had started with nothing and created everything would not be forgotten. The barrel that Xavier had brought that first day, the barrel full of silver dollars that had changed Kira's life, was preserved by the family as a reminder of how one act of generosity and belief could ripple outward through time. It sat in Catherine's home, polished and maintained, a symbol of the moment when everything changed, when a desperate woman was told she could weave for pleasure instead of survival. And in workshops and studios across the West, women sat with willow reeds and ash strips, creating baskets that were both beautiful and functional, weaving their own stories into fiber and pattern. Some wove for salt money, as Kira had once done, driven by necessity and determination. But others wove for pleasure, as Xavier had wanted Kira to do, creating beauty for its own sake. And all of them, whether they knew it or not, were carrying forward the legacy of a woman who had refused to let poverty define her, and a man who had seen her worth when she could barely see it herself. The story of Kira Lambert and Xavier Cordell became legend in the Black Hills, told and retold until it was hard to separate fact from embellishment. But the core truth remained constant, that love and support could transform lives, that art and craft were worthy of respect and investment, that beauty created under duress was still beauty, but beauty created in freedom was transcendent. Theirs was a love story, yes, but it was also a story about possibility, about what happens when someone sees your potential and gives you the space to realize it. On quiet evenings, when the sun set over Lade and Deadwood, painting the hills in shades of orange and purple, people would sometimes speak of seeing two figures sitting together on a porch, watching the light fade. One would be weaving, hands moving in practiced patterns, while the other watched with love and admiration clear in every glance. Whether these sightings were real or imagined did not matter. Kira and Xavier's presence remained in the land they had loved, in the work they had done, in the lives they had touched. And somewhere, in a museum in Chicago, the massive basket Kira had created for the World's Fair still stood, telling its story of women and weaving and the West. Visitors would pause before it, reading the placard that explained its significance, learning about the basket maker from Lead, South Dakota, who had turned her craft into art, her struggle into triumph. They would marvel at the intricacy of the work, at the way light played through the woven patterns, at the story rendered in fiber and reed. And occasionally, someone would look at that basket and feel inspired, would go home and create something of their own, would refuse to let circumstance limit their potential. That was the true legacy of Kira Lambert Cordell and Xavier Cordell. Not the money they had earned or the business they had built, but the belief they had embodied and passed on. The belief that everyone deserves the freedom to create, that supporting others costs nothing compared to what it gives, that love means seeing someone's worth and helping them see it too. They had started with a barrel of silver dollars and a simple invitation to weave for pleasure instead of survival. They had ended with a legacy that touched thousands of lives and would continue to touch lives for generations to come. The baskets remained, of course, in homes across the country, in museums and galleries, in the hands of students learning the craft. Each one was a testament to what Kira had achieved, to the beauty she had created, to the life she had woven for herself with Xavier's support and her own indomitable will. They were more than baskets. They were stories woven in willow and ash, tales of transformation and love, proof that one person's belief in another could change the world. And if you listened carefully, very carefully, to the wind moving through the Black Hills, you might hear it whispering the words that had started everything. Weave for pleasure now. Not a command, not a demand, but an invitation. An invitation to create freely, to love deeply, to support generously, to see the value in what others might overlook. An invitation that Kira had accepted all those years ago, and that echoed still through time, calling to anyone with ears to hear and heart to answer. The story ended, as all stories must, with the closing of the circle. The girl who had woven baskets for salt money, whose fingers had bled onto her work, had become the woman whose art inspired generations. The cowboy who had brought a barrel and said, "Weave for pleasure now," had become the man whose love had unlocked possibilities neither of them could have imagined. Together, they had woven something more precious than any basket, more valuable than any fortune, a life of meaning, connection, and joy. A life worth celebrating, worth remembering, worth weaving into the stories we tell ourselves about what is possible when we see each other truly, love each other fully, and support each other completely.